In a galaxy where power is measured by the length of one's fangs and the coldness of one's blood, where alien royalty compete in deadly games for the ultimate prize, one human woman would shatter every rule ever written about love, war, and survival. They called her the Vampire Princess of Earth, not because she thirsted for blood, but because she had learned to drink the life force of stars themselves. Every alien prince, from the Zephyrian Empire to the crystal courts of Andromeda, would kill for her hand in marriage. They saw her as the key to unlimited power, the bridge between their dying worlds and Earth's mysterious energy. But Princess Lyra Blackthorn had her own plans, and they involved neither marriage nor surrender. What these alien suitors didn't know was that Earth's last princess carried within her veins something far more dangerous than vampire blood. She carried the fury of species that had been hunted, enslaved, and nearly extinct. She carried the memory of 7 billion human souls who had refused to kneel. And when she finally made her choice, it wouldn't be the Golden Prince of Arcturus, or the Crystal Lord of Vega, or even the Shadow King of the Void Realms who would claim her heart. It would be someone nobody saw coming. Someone who would help her turn the entire galaxy's hunger for human submission into humanity's greatest weapon. This is the story of how one woman's unexpected choice sparked a revolution that would either save humanity or damn every living soul in the known universe. The hunt begins now. The crimson moon of Zirion cast its bloody light across the obsidian palace walls as Princess Lyra Blackthorn stood before the council of suitors. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the darkness, and her midnight black hair cascaded down her shoulders like liquid shadow. The assembled alien nobility watched her with hungry eyes, each believing they understood what she was, what she represented. They were all wrong. The Vampire Princess of Earth honors us with her presence, announced Chancellor Vorik, his 3 heads speaking in perfect unison. The Cerberan diplomat's silver robes rustled as he gestured toward the waiting princes. Tonight, you shall choose your consort from among the greatest rulers in the known galaxy. Lyra's emerald eyes swept across the assembled suitors without emotion. Prince Zalthar of the Zephyrian Empire stood closest to the throne, his golden skin shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that marked his royal bloodline. His 4 arms were crossed confidently over his chest, and his violet eyes burned with barely contained desire. Behind him loomed Lord Kristin of the Andromedan courts, his translucent body refracting the moonlight into 1,000 rainbow fragments. His crystalline form hummed with harmonic frequencies that could shatter mountains. To her left stood Prince Nyx of the Void Realms, his form shifting between solid and shadow, his red eyes glowing like dying stars. His very presence seemed to drink the light from the room, creating patches of absolute darkness that moved with his breathing. These were beings who commanded fleets that could glass entire solar systems, who ruled over trillions of subjects across dozens of star systems. And they all wanted her. Princess Lyra. Prince Zalthar stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. The Zephyrian Empire offers you 17 star systems as a wedding gift. Your children would rule over species that span half the galaxy. Choose me, and humanity will never know one again. Amusing. Lord Kristin's voice resonated like crystal wind chimes in a hurricane. The Andromedan courts offer something far more valuable, immortality. Your consciousness merged with our crystal matrix would make you eternal. Your people could achieve technological advancement beyond their wildest dreams. Evolution itself would bow before our union. Prince Nyx said nothing, but the shadows around him deepened, and whispers in dead languages filled the air. His offer needed no words. The Void Realms promised power over death itself, dominion over the spaces between stars where ancient horrors slumbered. Lyra listened to their promises with the patience of someone who had heard them all before. These alien princes saw her as the key to Earth's mysterious energy fields, the source of humanity's stubborn refusal to submit to galactic authority. They believed that by claiming her, they would gain access to whatever force had allowed humans to survive the Great Purge 20 years ago, when the Galactic Confederation had decided that Earth was too dangerous to exist. What they didn't understand was that the force they sensed wasn't magical or technological. It was something far more dangerous. It was human rage, refined into purpose. Your offers are generous, Lyra said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. But I wonder if any of you truly understand what you're asking for. We understand perfectly. Prince Zalthar's confidence never wavered. We seek union with the vampire princess of Earth, the woman who drinks the energy of stars, who commands the loyalty of the last human settlements. Together, we would be unstoppable. Lyra almost smiled at that. The title Vampire Princess had been their creation, not hers. They had observed her abilities from afar and drawn their own conclusions. They saw her absorbing energy from dying stars to power Earth's defensive systems and assumed she was some kind of energy vampire. They witnessed her pale skin and dark attire and created mythology around her supposed supernatural nature. The truth was far simpler and infinitely more terrifying. She was just a human being who had learned to hate with perfect clarity. "Tell me," she said, taking a step down from her throne, "what do you know of Earth's history before the Great Purge?" The alien princes exchanged glances. This wasn't the response they had expected. "Earth was a primitive world," Lord Kristen replied. "Your species had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. You were technologically inferior, spiritually undeveloped, and socially chaotic. The Confederation's decision to cleanse your world was based on careful analysis of your species' violent tendencies and inability to coexist with galactic civilization. And yet," Lyra continued her descent, each step echoing through the chamber, "here I stand. The last princess of a supposedly extinct species, commanding enough power to make the greatest empires in the galaxy compete for my favor. How do you reconcile that?" Prince Nyx's shadow form solidified slightly. "We assume your people possessed hidden potential that revealed itself under extreme duress. Survival pressure often unlocks dormant abilities." Lyra reached the bottom of the steps and began walking slowly around the circle of suitors. Each prince turned to keep her in sight, their massive forms dwarfing her human stature. To any observer, she looked like prey circling predators. They couldn't have been more wrong. "You speak of potential," she said. "You're correct that extreme pressure reveals hidden abilities. But you've misunderstood the nature of what was hidden." She stopped in front of Prince Zalthar, looking up at his towering golden form. "Your empire spans 17 star systems. How many sentient species live within your borders?" 43 fully cataloged species, with several developing civilizations under protective observation, he answered proudly. "And how many of those species chose to join your empire willingly?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Prince Zalthar's bioluminescent patterns flickered slightly. "Choice is irrelevant when survival is at stake. We provide order, protection, and purpose to species that would otherwise destroy themselves." "Ah." Lyra nodded, as if he had confirmed something important. "And you, Lord Kristen, how many worlds have your courts assimilated?" "The concept of assimilation implies unwillingness," the crystal being replied. "We offer evolution, the chance to transcend biological limitations. Every species we encounter ultimately recognizes the superiority of crystalline existence. Because those who refuse recognition are eliminated," Lyra observed. "And you, Prince Nyx, the Void Realms have a reputation for making entire populations simply disappear. Where do they go?" The Shadow Prince's red eyes flared. "They achieve unity with the Void. Individual existence is an illusion, a source of suffering. We offer release from the burden of self." Lyra completed her circuit and returned to the center of the chamber. "So we have conquest disguised as protection, forced evolution called transcendence, and extinction presented as enlightenment. You've built your empires on the graves of free choice." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. The alien princes began to sense that this conversation wasn't proceeding as planned. "Your point, princess?" Chancellor Vorix, three-head, spoke with poorly concealed irritation. "My point," Lyra said, and for the first time that evening, she smiled, "is that you've all made the same mistake. You looked at humanity and saw what you expected to see, another species to be cataloged, conquered, and controlled. You assumed our stubborn resistance was just another form of primitive aggression that could be bred out or suppressed." She raised her hand, and the air around her began to shimmer with a faint golden energy. "What you fail to understand is that human resistance isn't primitive. It's refined. We've been perfecting the art of defying impossible odds for our entire evolutionary history." The energy around her intensified, and suddenly Every alien in the chamber could feel it, a pressure against their minds, their souls, their very existence. It wasn't the cold hunger of a vampire or the alien power of some supernatural entity. It was pure, distilled human willpower, focused into a weapon. Every human child learns the stories, Lyra continued, her voice never changing in tone, even as the power radiating from her made the obsidian walls begin to crack. David and Goliath, Spartacus and Rome, the Alamo, Thermopylae, Warsaw. We collect tales of impossible defiance like other species collect precious gems, and we pass them down through generations like sacred texts. Prince Zalthar took an involuntary step backward. "What are you?" "I'm exactly what you called me," Lyra replied. "A vampire, but not the kind you imagined. I don't drink blood or steal life force from stars. I feed on something much more abundant in this galaxy." The golden energy exploded outward from her body, washing over the assembled aliens like a tide. As it touched them, each prince felt something they had never experienced before. The absolute, unshakable conviction that freedom was worth any price, that dignity mattered more than survival, that some things were more important than living. They felt what it meant to be human. "I feed on surrender," Lyra said as the alien staggered under the psychic assault of pure human determination. "I consume the moment when tyrants realize their victims will never submit. I drink the fear in the eyes of those who discover that there are people in this universe who would rather burn everything to ash than kneel." The palace guards, all heavily armed members of various conquered species, began backing toward the exits. Their weapons, designed to kill beings far more powerful than a single human female, felt suddenly inadequate in their hands. 20 years ago, the Galactic Confederation decided humanity was too dangerous to exist, Lyra continued. They were absolutely right. But they misunderstood the nature of the danger. They thought we were threatening because we were violent, chaotic, unpredictable. She took a step toward Prince Zalthar, and the massive golden alien found himself backing away from a being barely a third his size. The real danger isn't that humans are violent. The real danger is that we're contagious. Every species we encounter, every civilization we interact with, starts asking dangerous questions. Why do we submit to beings who offer nothing but control? Why do we trade freedom for safety? Why do we accept that some people are born to rule while others are born to serve? Lord Kristen's crystalline form was beginning to resonate at frequencies that suggested profound distress. "You speak of chaos. Without order, without hierarchy, civilization collapses." "Perhaps," Lyra agreed. "But slavery is not civilization. Conquest is not order. And fear is not respect." She turned toward the massive doors of the chamber, and they swung open at her approach. Standing in the doorway was a figure none of the assembled aliens had expected to see. It was a human male, tall and lean, wearing the simple brown robes of a maintenance worker. His dark skin bore the scars of hard labor, and his hands were calloused from years of manual work. He looked utterly ordinary, unremarkable in every way except for his eyes. His eyes held the same impossible determination that radiated from Lyra's aura. "Princes of the Galaxy," Lyra said, "may I introduce Engineer Marcus Chun, formerly of the Earth colony ship Endurance. Currently, he serves as head of waste management for the Xerian orbital platform." The alien nobles stared in confusion. A janitor? A maintenance worker? What possible relevance could such a being have to their negotiations? "Marcus," Lyra said, "would you like to tell these gentlemen about the last 20 years? The ordinary human man stepped into the chamber, and his presence somehow made the assembled alien royalty feel small. 20 years ago, Marcus said in a voice rough from years of breathing recycled air, the Confederation's fleet arrived at Earth with an ultimatum: submit to galactic authority or face extinction. Prince Nix's shadow form flickered. Your species chose extinction rather than submit. It was regrettable, but necessary. Marcus smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. No, your darkness. We chose a third option. He reached into his robe and pulled out a small device that looked like nothing more than a maintenance scanner. We chose to survive long enough to make submission irrelevant. The device in his hands began to emit a soft humming sound, and suddenly, every alien in the chamber was receiving data streams directly into their consciousness. Images, files, technical specifications, and, most terrifying of all, locations. For 20 years, Marcus continued. Humans have been working in the maintenance systems of every major space station, orbital platform, and capital ship in the galaxy. We're invisible to you, just part of the background infrastructure that keeps your civilizations running. The data streams intensified, and the alien princes began to understand what they were seeing. Detailed schematics of their most secure facilities, access codes to their most classified systems, the locations of their families, their treasures, their most vital strategic resources. We've been mapping your weaknesses, Lyra said, her voice cutting through their growing horror. Learning your languages, understanding your technologies, and, most importantly, talking to your people. The ones you've conquered, the ones you've enslaved, the ones you've convinced to submit for the sake of peace. Prince Zalthar's golden skin had lost its luminescence. This is impossible. Our security systems are designed by species that think like you, Marcus interrupted. Species that see security as something imposed from above. You never considered that the greatest threat might come from below, from the people you don't even notice. The humming device in his hands pulsed once, and throughout the galaxy, on 1,000 different worlds, similar devices activated. In waste management centers, and maintenance shafts, in service corridors, and forgotten storage bays, humans began to emerge from their places of concealment. They had been waiting for this signal for 20 years. The choice you offer me tonight was whether to become your consort, your partner in ruling over the galaxy, Lyra said. But you're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. She gestured toward Marcus, toward the ordinary human man who had just revealed that humanity had spent 2 decades infiltrating every major power structure in known space. I didn't choose him because he was unexpected. I chose him because he represents what you never understood about humanity. You can't rule us because we don't acknowledge your authority. You can't conquer us because we don't recognize your superiority. And you can't eliminate us because we're already everywhere. The obsidian walls of the palace began to shake as explosions echoed from the orbital platforms surrounding Zirian. Not destructive explosions, precision strikes that disabled communication arrays, weapon systems, and faster-than-light drives. What do you want? Lord Kristen's harmonic voice had become a discordant shriek. Lyra looked at each of the alien princes in turn, her emerald eyes reflecting the fires that were beginning to burn in the sky above them. We want what we've always wanted, she said, to be left alone, to make our own choices, to succeed or fail by our own efforts rather than by your permission. She took Marcus's scarred hand in hers, and the simple gesture somehow contained more power than all the threats and promises that had filled the chamber that night. The age of galactic empires built on conquest is ending, she said. Not because we're destroying you, but because we're offering your subjects something you never could, the choice to be free. As if summoned by her words, new figures began entering the chamber. Not humans, but representatives of dozens of species that had supposedly been pacified, assimilated, or conquered by the great galactic powers. They wore the same simple work clothes as Marcus, the same unremarkable uniforms that had made them invisible for so long. They had been listening, learning, and waiting. The revolution has already begun, Lyra announced. Not with weapons or warfare, but with ideas. The idea that no being has the right to rule another without consent. The idea that freedom is more valuable than safety. The idea that every sentient creature deserves the dignity of choice. The chamber filled with the sound of distant ships launching, not in attack formations, but in exodus patterns. Across the galaxy, entire populations that had been considered safely subjugated were making the same choice their human inspirators had made 20 years ago. They were choosing freedom over security, uncertainty over oppression, the dangerous path over the safe cage. As the last echoes of the old order began to crumble around them, Princess Lyra Blackthorn and Engineer Marcus Chun stood together in the ruins of an empire, watching the birth of something entirely new. The galaxy would never be the same. 3 days after the Zirian revelation, as the galactic news networks had begun calling it, Marcus Chun stood in the abandoned cargo bay of a drifting freighter, watching the most powerful beings in the galaxy argue like children. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been moved from the traditional chambers on Centralis Prime to this neutral location after 17 assassination attempts in the first 48 hours. Nobody trusted anyone anymore, and with good reason. The careful balance of power that had maintained galactic civilization for 3 millennia was collapsing faster than a dying star. "This is your fault, Zalthar." Lord Kristen's crystalline form vibrated with barely contained fury. "Your intelligence services assured us that human infiltration was contained to the Outer Rim colonies." Prince Zalthar's golden skin had dulled to the color of tarnished brass. His forearms gestured frantically as he tried to maintain his composure. "My services reported what they observed. How could we have known that humans were deliberately presenting themselves as primitive laborers while systematically infiltrating our infrastructure? Because," came a new voice from the shadows, "you never bothered to actually study your enemy." Every head in the cargo bay turned toward the speaker. Admiral Vex of the Void Fleet materialized from the darkness between the storage containers, her scarred face bearing the marks of someone who had seen actual combat rather than ceremonial displays of power. Unlike the preening princes, Vex had earned her position through military competence rather than genetic lottery. "Explain," demanded Prince Nyx, his shadow form coiling with agitation. "I've been reviewing the historical records," Admiral Vex said, producing a holographic display that filled the center of the bay. "Every conflict humanity has ever engaged in, going back to their pre-spaceflight era. The pattern is consistent and terrifying." The hologram shifted to show a primitive battlefield from Earth's ancient history. Human soldiers in crude armor faced overwhelming odds against a much larger, better-equipped force. Thermopylae. 300 Spartan warriors held off an army of hundreds of thousands. They knew they would die. They chose to die. But their sacrifice inspired others to continue fighting. The scene changed to show a more recent conflict. Humans in environment suits fighting against impossible odds on an airless moon. The Battle of Titan Station. 57 human defenders against a Kethmar invasion fleet. They held for 18 days with no hope of rescue or reinforcement. When the station finally fell, they had disabled enough ships to cripple the entire invasion force. Prince Zalthar's bioluminescent patterns flickered nervously. "What's your point, Admiral?" "My point," Vex said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much death, "is that humans don't fight to win. They fight to make the cost of victory so high that winning becomes meaningless." She gestured, and the hologram displayed the current situation across the galaxy. Red markers indicated systems where rebellion had erupted, yellow showed areas of civil unrest, and green represented regions still under Imperial control. There was far more red and yellow than anyone in the Bay wanted to see. "We're not facing a conventional revolution," Admiral Vex continued. "We're facing something much worse. We're facing a species that has weaponized martyrdom." Lord Kristen's harmonic voice carried notes of confusion. "Martyrdom is inefficient. Death achieves nothing." "That's where you're wrong," said a familiar voice from behind them. Every alien in the bay spun toward the source of the sound, weapons appearing in hands with reflexive speed. Standing at the entrance to the cargo bay were two figures that should not have been able to reach this location undetected. Princess Lyra Blackthorn and Engineer Marcus Chun walked into the bay as casually as if they had been invited. Lyra wore the same dark dress she had worn at the Xerian Palace, but Marcus had traded his maintenance coveralls for simple black clothing that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. "How did you get past our security?" Prince Nyx demanded, his shadow form solidifying into something more threatening. "We didn't," Marcus replied. "Your security let us pass. Or more accurately, they chose to let us pass." Admiral Vex's eyes narrowed. "Impossible. These are hand-picked elite forces, the most loyal soldiers in our respective fleets." "Loyalty," Lyra said, moving further into the bay, "is not the same thing as agreement. Your soldiers are loyal to their duty, their honor, their comrades. That doesn't mean they're loyal to you." She gestured, and suddenly, the bay was filled with more figures than should have been able to fit in the space. Soldiers in the uniforms of a dozen different military organizations stood at attention, but their weapons were pointed at their own commanders rather than at the two humans. "Allow me to introduce Lieutenant Commander Thexes of the Zephyrian Imperial Guard," Lyra said, indicating a tall, insectoid figure whose compound eyes reflected the overhead lighting. "He's been asking interesting questions about why his people are required to enforce policies they never voted for." The indicated soldier stepped forward, his mandibles clicking in what Marcus had learned to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of nervous determination. "With respect, Your Highness," Thexes said to Prince Zalthar, "I swore an oath to protect the Zephyrian people." I'm beginning to question whether that oath requires me to protect the Zephyrian government. Prince Zalthar's forearms trembled with rage. You swore loyalty to the Empire, Commander. I am the Empire. No, Fexes replied, his voice carrying the quiet conviction that Marcus had come to recognize in people who had been exposed to human ideas for too long. You are a person who claims to represent the Empire. The Empire is an idea, a concept of shared purpose and mutual benefit. If you no longer serve that concept, then you're no longer the Empire. Similar scenes were playing out around the bay as soldiers from each faction faced their commanders with the same quiet rebellion. The careful hierarchy that had maintained galactic civilization was dissolving in real time. Admiral Vex raised her sidearm toward Marcus, but the gesture felt hollow even to her. What have you done to them? We talked to them, Marcus said simply. We asked them questions. Simple questions like who benefits from the current system, and what would happen if people had a right to choose their own governments, and why do some beings get to rule while others have to serve? You've infected them with chaos, Lord Kristen accused, his crystalline form beginning to resonate at frequencies that suggested imminent violence. We've infected them with curiosity, Lyra corrected, which, from your perspective, amounts to the same thing. She moved to the center of the bay, directly beneath the holographic display that still showed the spreading rebellion across the galaxy. Admiral Vex is correct about one thing. Humans have weaponized martyrdom, but she misunderstands the nature of the weapon. The hologram shifted at her gesture, showing not just the current rebellions, but their underlying patterns. Each outbreak of resistance was connected to others by lines of communication, trade routes, and simple personal contact. Martyrdom isn't about dying for a cause, Lyra explained. It's about living in such a way that your death becomes a message. When someone is willing to sacrifice everything for an idea, it forces everyone who witnesses that sacrifice to ask themselves what ideas they would die for. Marcus stepped beside her, his scarred hands clasping behind his back in a posture that somehow conveyed more authority than all the ceremonial regalia in the room. 20 years ago, Earth died, he said. 7 billion human beings were exterminated because they refused to submit to galactic authority. Every person in this galaxy watched it happen, and every person in this galaxy was told the same thing. This is what happens to those who refuse to obey. Prince Nix's red eyes flared. It was a necessary demonstration. Order must be maintained. You're right, Marcus agreed, and his calm acceptance was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. It was a demonstration, but not the kind you intended. The hologram shifted again, showing the aftermath of Earth's destruction. Refugee ships scattered across the galaxy, human survivors integrating into existing populations as laborers, servants, and maintenance workers. Every alien who worked alongside a human survivor heard the same story, Marcus continued. A story about people who chose death over submission. About a species that looked at the most powerful civilization in galactic history and said no. And every time someone heard that story, Lyra added, they started asking themselves the same question. What would I choose? Admiral Vex was beginning to understand the scope of what she was facing. You turned your own extinction into propaganda. We turned our extinction into proof of concept, Lyra corrected. Proof that resistance is possible. Proof that there are things more important than survival. Proof that even the most powerful empires can be defied. The bay fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems and the distant rumble of ships moving through the vacuum outside. The assembled alien leaders were beginning to comprehend the true magnitude of the crisis they faced. What do you want? Prince Zalthar finally asked, his voice stripped of its former arrogance. We want what we've always wanted, Marcus replied. Freedom. Self-determination. The right to succeed or fail based on our own choices rather than your permission. And what about the chaos that will follow? Lord Kristen demanded. What about the wars, the conflicts, the suffering that will result from the collapse of galactic order? Lyra's emerald eyes fixed on the crystalline being with the intensity of a laser. What about the wars, conflicts, and suffering that result from maintaining galactic order? How many worlds have been subjugated to prevent rebellion? How many species have been eliminated to maintain stability? How many individuals have been crushed to preserve hierarchy? She gestured toward the holographic display, and it shifted to show not just current events, but historical ones. Centuries of conquest disguised as pacification, genocide presented as evolution, and slavery dressed up as protection. Your galactic order is built on the bones of every civilization that ever asked the wrong questions, she said. The only difference between your system and chaos is that you've organized your violence more efficiently. Prince Nyx's shadow form began to expand, filling more of the bay with darkness. You offer destruction disguised as liberation. We offer choice, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the supernatural gloom like a beacon. The choice to build something better. The choice to fail on your own terms rather than succeed on someone else's. The choice to be free rather than safe. The soldier who had been identified as Lieutenant Commander Thexes stepped forward again, his compound eyes reflecting the display's light. "If I may, sir," he said to Prince Zalthar, "I've seen the human settlements on the Outer Rim. The ones that survived the purge by hiding in asteroid fields and dead systems. They're not paradise, but they're not hell either. They're just different." "Different how?" Admiral Vex asked, her military training overriding her political loyalties. "They argue," Thexes said, and there was something like wonder in his clicking voice. "They disagree about everything: resource allocation, development priorities, social policies. Sometimes the arguments get heated. Sometimes they make mistakes." He paused, looking around the bay at the assembled leaders of galactic civilization. "But when they make mistakes, they fix them. When they disagree, they find compromises. When they argue, they listen to each other. And nobody has the right to make decisions for everyone else without asking first." The silence that followed was profound. These were beings who had never lived in a world where authority could be questioned, where power had to be justified, where leadership required consent rather than just strength. "It sounds inefficient," Lord Kristen said finally. "It is," Lyra agreed. "Democracy is slow, messy, and frustrating. It requires constant negotiation, endless compromise, and the humility to admit when you're wrong." "Then why choose it?" Prince Nyx asked, and for the first time since Marcus had known him, the Shadow Prince sounded genuinely curious rather than threatening. "Because the alternative," Marcus said, "is what you have now. A galaxy where might makes right, where the strong rule the weak, and where questioning authority is a crime punishable by extinction." He gestured toward the display, toward the spreading rebellions that were dismantling 3 millennia of carefully constructed hierarchy. "You asked what we want. Here's our answer. We want every sentient being in this galaxy to have the same choice we gave ourselves 20 years ago. The choice between freedom and safety, between self-determination and security, between dignity and survival." "And if they choose safety?" Admiral Vex asked. "If they prefer security to freedom?" "Then that's their choice to make," Lyra said. "But it has to be their choice. Not a decision made for them by their betters. Not a policy imposed by superior force. Not a fate assigned by genetic lottery or military conquest." The holographic display shifted one final time, showing not the current rebellions, but projections of potential futures. Some showed peaceful transitions to democratic governance. Others depicted violent revolutions. And still others displayed the complete collapse of interstellar civilization. "The galaxy is going to change," Marcus said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had seen the future and accepted its implications. "The only question is whether that change will be guided by the principles of consent and self-determination, or whether it will be driven by the same forces of conquest and domination that have defined galactic history for the past 3,000 years. Prince Zalthar looked at the projections, at the spreading rebellions, at the soldiers who had turned their weapons toward their own commanders. His golden skin had lost all of its luminescence, and his 4 arms hung at his sides in defeat. "You're asking us to give up everything we are," he said. "We're asking you to become something better," Lyra replied. "We're asking you to choose evolution over extinction, growth over stagnation, hope over fear." She turned toward the entrance of the bay, Marcus falling into step beside her. The soldiers parted to let them pass, but their weapons remained trained on their former commanders. "The revolution has already begun," Lyra said over her shoulder. "The only choice you have left is whether to join it or be consumed by it." As they reached the entrance, Marcus turned back toward the assembled alien leaders one final time. "For 20 years," he said, "humans have been learning to live without empires, without hierarchies, without the comfortable certainties of absolute authority. It's been difficult, sometimes painful, often frustrating." He smiled, and there was something in that expression that spoke of possibilities none of them had ever imagined. But we've never been happier to be alive. The bay doors closed behind them, leaving the former rulers of the galaxy alone with their soldiers, their fears, and the knowledge that the universe had changed forever. Outside, in the vast emptiness of space, refugee ships from 1,000 different worlds were already beginning to gather. They carried beings who had heard the human message and made their choice. They were choosing freedom, whatever the cost. 6 months after the Zirian revelation, the galaxy was burning. Not with the clean fire of orbital bombardment or the precise destruction of military campaigns, but with the chaotic blaze of revolutionary fervor. On 1,700 worlds, populations that had been considered safely subjugated were demanding representation, rights, and, most dangerously of all, explanations. Admiral Sarah Chun, no relation to Marcus despite the shared name, stood on the bridge of the human vessel Defiance and watched the latest report stream across her tactical display. The ship was one of 50 that humanity had managed to construct in the years since Earth's fall, built in hidden shipyards in the deep void between stars. They weren't impressive by galactic standards, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to be fast enough to spread the word. "Ma'am," reported Lieutenant Kowalski from the communication station, "we're receiving requests for assistance from 43 different systems. The Altaran Mining Collective wants help organizing their first democratic elections. The vegan agricultural worlds are asking for advice on writing a constitution. And the Centauri Trade Federation." He paused, checking his instruments. "They want to know how to conduct a peaceful revolution." Admiral Chun allowed herself a small smile. The Centauri were among the most conservative species in the galaxy, prizing stability above all else. If even they were questioning the established order, the revolution had reached a tipping point. "What's our status on the Broken Chains Protocol?" "Phase 3 is complete," reported the tactical officer. "We've successfully extracted human operatives from 87% of targeted Imperial installations. The remaining 13% have chosen to remain in place as observers." The Broken Chains Protocol had been Marcus Chin's final gift to the revolution before disappearing with Princess Lyra into the depths of uncharted space. For 20 years, humans had infiltrated the infrastructure of galactic civilization. Now they were systematically revealing themselves, not as conquerors but as teachers, sharing everything they had learned about resistance, organization, and, most importantly, hope. "Admiral," the communications officer continued, "we're also receiving some less friendly messages. The Zephyrian Empire has declared us enemies of galactic peace. The Andromedan courts have announced a bounty of 10 million credits for Princess Lyra's capture. And Prince Nix has issued what I think is a formal challenge to ritual combat. Any responses from our diplomatic corps?" Lieutenant Kowalski consulted his display again. Ambassador Rodriguez transmitted our standard reply to all three. Quote, "We respectfully decline to recognize the authority of any government that rules without the consent of the governed." Unquote. Admiral Chen nodded approvingly. The diplomatic response had been crafted carefully to sound polite while being absolutely uncompromising. It was amazing how much chaos you could create with well-chosen words. "Ma'am," the tactical officer interrupted, "we have incoming ships. 3 vessels. Mixed configuration. They're not broadcasting standard identification codes. Put them on screen." The main display shifted to show 3 ships approaching from different vectors. Admiral Chun recognized the designs immediately. A Zephyrian battlecruiser, an Andromedan crystal ship, and something she had never seen before, a vessel that seemed to be built from living shadow. "They're hailing us," communications reported. "Open the channel." The screen divided into 3 sections, each showing a different alien face. Prince Zalthar's golden features had been marked by stress lines that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Lord Kristen's crystalline form flickered with unstable harmonics. And, in the 3rd section, Prince Nix appeared more solid than usual, his red eyes burning with something that might have been desperation. "Admiral Chun," Prince Zalthar began, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance, "we request permission to come aboard for negotiations." "This is highly irregular," Admiral Chun replied. "The 3 of you represent empires that are currently at war with each other as much as with us. What possible common ground could we have for discussion?" The common ground. Lord Kristen's harmonic voice carried notes of something approaching humility, of impending mutual destruction. Our empires are collapsing. Our populations are in open revolt. Our military forces are deserting in record numbers. Prince Nix's shadow form solidified enough to convey emotional expression. We come not as conquerors, but as students. We wish to learn from your example. Admiral Chun studied the three alien leaders for a long moment. 6 months ago, these beings had commanded fleets that could glass entire solar systems. Now they were asking for help from the species they had tried to exterminate. Very well, she said finally. You may come aboard. But understand that you come as private individuals, not as representatives of your governments. We don't negotiate with empires. We only talk with people. An hour later, the three former rulers of galactic civilization sat in the Defiance-S conference room, looking distinctly uncomfortable in chairs designed for human proportions. Admiral Chen sat across from them, flanked by her senior staff and a small, unremarkable woman with steel-gray hair. Allow me to introduce Dr. Elena Vasquez, Admiral Chen said. She's our leading expert on post-imperial social reconstruction. Dr. Vasquez smiled pleasantly, the kind of expression that might belong to someone's grandmother rather than a revolutionary theorist. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I understand you're experiencing some difficulties with civil unrest. Prince Zalthar's forearms gestured frantically. Difficulties? My empire is disintegrating. 17 worlds have declared independence in the past month alone. My own military commanders are questioning direct orders. My population is demanding something they call representation in government decisions. And this troubles you why? Dr. Vasquez asked, her tone genuinely curious. Because Zalthar paused, apparently struggling to articulate something he had never had to explain before. Because I am the Empire. My bloodline has ruled for 3,000 years. The idea that common citizens should have input into governance is its chaos. Dr. Vasquez nodded, as if this made perfect sense. I see. And how has that system been working for your people? It has provided stability, order, security. For whom? Interrupted Dr. Vasquez gently. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Prince Zalthar's golden skin flickered with bioluminescent patterns that suggested deep confusion. For everyone, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Really? Dr. Vasquez produced a data tablet and consulted it briefly. According to our intelligence reports, the Zephyrian Empire includes 43 distinct species across 17 star systems. How many of those species were consulted before being incorporated into your empire? Consultation wasn't necessary, Zalthar replied. We offered protection, advancement, participation in galactic civilization. You offered, Dr. Vasquez noted. Did anyone ever decline your offer? The silence that followed was answer enough. Lord Kristen's crystalline form resonated with harmonic frequencies that suggested agitation. Our methods may seem harsh to primitive mindsets, but the alternative is chaos. Without strong leadership, without clear hierarchy, civilization collapses into violence and disorder. Has it? Dr. Vasquez asked, turning her attention to the crystal being. Do you have evidence of his collapse occurring in human-influenced systems? Well, no, Kristen admitted, but it's a logical inevitability. Without central authority to impose order emerges naturally from cooperation, Dr. Vasquez interrupted. It doesn't need to be imposed. In fact, imposed order is usually just organized oppression wearing a fancy uniform. She gestured, and the room's display system activated, showing images from across the galaxy. Human settlements, refugee communities, and newly liberated worlds were depicted in various stages of social reconstruction. This is the Kepler colony, Dr. Vasquez explained, indicating a thriving space station orbiting a red dwarf star. 6 months ago, it was a slave labor mining operation controlled by Andromedan overseers. Today, it's a self-governing community of 12 different species working together to build something new. The image shifted to show a busy spaceport where beings of various species worked side by side, loading cargo, maintaining ships, and engaging in what appeared to be normal commercial activity. How do they resolve disputes? Prince Nix asked, his shadow form flickering with what might have been interest. They talk, Dr. Vasquez said simply. They negotiate. They compromise. They vote. They accept that sometimes they'll make mistakes and work together to fix them. But who has final authority? Prince Zalthar demanded. Who makes the difficult decisions? who ensures that the strong don't exploit the weak. Dr. Vasquez smiled again, and there was something in that expression that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Everyone and no one. Authority comes from consensus, not from birthright or conquest. Difficult decisions are made by the people who will have to live with the consequences. And the strong are prevented from exploiting the weak by the simple fact that the weak have a voice in the process. The three alien leaders exchanged glances that conveyed profound confusion. These were concepts that challenged everything they understood about governance, society, and the nature of power itself. It sounds inefficient, Lord Kristen observed. It is, Admiral Chun agreed, speaking for the first time since the introductions. Democracy is messy, slow, and frustrating. But it has one advantage over your system, which is, it works, Chin said simply. Not perfectly, not always, but it works because it's based on the consent of the governed rather than the power of the governors. Prince Nix leaned forward, his red eyes burning with intensity. And what of those who refuse to consent? What of those who choose disorder over order, chaos over stability? Then, that's their choice to make, Dr. Vasquez replied. Freedom includes the freedom to make bad decisions. But it also includes the freedom to learn from those decisions and make better ones next time. She gestured again, and the display showed a different image, a world where volcanic activity had made most of the surface uninhabitable, forcing the population to live in underground cities connected by tunnel networks. This is Haven Prime, she explained. 2 years ago, they tried to maintain their old imperial system even after the local governor fled. It lasted exactly 6 weeks before the resource allocation system collapsed, and people started starving. The image shifted to show the same world in the present, still harsh, still challenging, but clearly thriving with bustling markets, functioning infrastructure, and what appeared to be contentment among the population. So they tried something different, Dr. Vasquez continued. They formed councils representing each underground city, established fair trade agreements between communities, and created a system for sharing resources based on need rather than political favor. And if it had failed, Prince Zalthar asked, then they would have tried something else, Admiral Chin said. That's what free people do. They experiment, they adapt, they learn from their mistakes instead of just accepting them as inevitable. Prince Nix's shadow form began to shift and change, taking on shapes that suggested deep thought. You speak of freedom as if it were a simple thing. But freedom from what? Freedom to do what? Without structure, without guidance, how do people know what choices to make? Dr. Vasquez's smile became sad, almost pitying. Your darkness, with respect, you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't how people know what choices to make. The question is who has the right to make those choices for them. She stood and walked to the display, placing her hand on the surface as if she could touch the images of freed worlds and liberated populations. For 3,000 years, your empires have been answering that question the same way. We do. We know better. We are stronger, smarter, more evolved, more enlightened. We have the right to decide how others should live because we have the power to enforce those decisions. She turned back to face the three alien leaders, and her expression carried the weight of someone who had seen the true cost of such thinking. But power isn't wisdom. Strength isn't righteousness. And the ability to force compliance doesn't grant the authority to do so. The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. Outside the viewports, stars wheeled through the void, indifferent to the struggles of the beings who moved among them. What do you want from us? Lord Kristen asked finally, his crystalline form dim and flickering. Nothing, Admiral Chin said. We don't want anything from you because we don't need anything from you. That's what makes this conversation different from every other negotiation in galactic history. She gestured toward the display, toward the images of free worlds and liberated peoples. Every interaction your empires have ever had with other species has been based on need. You needed resources, territory, labor, compliance. Those needs gave you leverage, allowed you to dictate terms, forced others to submit to your will. But we don't need your submission, Dr. Vasquez added, returning to her seat. We don't need your resources or your territory or your acknowledgement of our authority. We just need you to stop preventing others from making their own choices. Prince Zalthar's golden skin had lost all of its luminescence. You're asking us to abdicate, to surrender everything we are, everything our ancestors built. We're asking you to evolve, Admiral Chen corrected, to become something better than conquerors, something more valuable than rulers. What could be more valuable than the power to command? Prince Nix asked, and for the first time, his voice carried genuine curiosity rather than threat. Dr. Vasquez smiled one more time, and this expression was filled with possibilities none of them had ever imagined. The respect that comes from earning rather than demanding. The satisfaction that comes from building rather than conquering. The peace that comes from knowing that your authority exists because people choose to grant it rather than because they're afraid to refuse it. She gestured toward the viewport, toward the stars, and the countless worlds that orbited them. Your empires are collapsing not because we destroyed them, but because the beings who supported them have discovered that there are alternatives. They've learned that they don't have to accept rule by force, governance without consent, or authority without accountability. The three former rulers of galactic civilization sat in stunned silence, contemplating the end of everything they had known and the beginning of something they couldn't yet understand. Outside the defiance, the galaxy continued its transformation. On 1,000 worlds, populations were learning to govern themselves. In 100-star systems, species that had been enemies for centuries were discovering they could negotiate instead of fight. Across the void, the children of conquered civilizations were writing constitutions, forming councils, and taking the first tentative steps toward building something that had never existed before. A galactic civilization based on choice rather than conquest, consent rather than compliance, hope rather than fear. It would be messy. It would be inefficient. It would sometimes fail, but it would be theirs. 1 year after the Xerian revelation, Princess Lyra Blackthorn stood on the observation deck of the human ship New Horizon and watched the first Galactic Constitutional Convention begin its sessions. The irony was not lost on her that they were meeting in orbit around the dead world that had once been Earth. The convention comprised representatives from over 3,000 worlds, each delegation having been chosen by methods their populations had determined for themselves. Some had held elections, others had conducted lotteries. Still others had appointed delegates through complex consensus-building processes that would have driven the old imperial administrators insane with frustration. It was beautiful chaos. Magnificent, isn't it? Marcus Chun joined her at the viewport, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. He wore the simple, gray uniform of the Constitutional Security Force, the volunteer organization that had taken responsibility for maintaining order during the convention without actually controlling it. And terrifying, Lyra added, watching as ships representing dozens of different architectural philosophies maneuvered around each other in carefully choreographed patterns. We've unleashed something that we can't control, can't predict, and can't take back. Good, Marcus said firmly. The moment we could control it would be the moment it stopped being freedom and started being just another form of empire. Through the transparent aluminum, they could see the conference habitat that had been constructed specifically for the convention. It was a marvel of cooperative engineering, built in sections by different species using different technologies, yet somehow forming a coherent whole. The Andromedan crystal growth techniques had been combined with Zephyrian energy manipulation and human modular construction methods, while the vegan agricultural systems provided life support and the Centauri trade networks had coordinated resource allocation. It should have been impossible. It should have collapsed under its own contradictions within days. Instead, it had become a symbol of what cooperation could achieve when it was based on voluntary participation rather than forced compliance. Update from the floor. Reported communications Officer Yamamoto from her station behind them. The Economic Rights Committee has reached consensus on Article 47. The Territorial Sovereignty Working Group is still debating the definition of informed consent in colonial expansion. And the Individual Liberty Caucus has submitted a formal proposal to include artificial intelligences in the definition of sentient beings with inherent rights. Marcus and Lyra exchanged glances. The AI rights question had been anticipated, but had arrived sooner than expected. It represented exactly the kind of complex ethical challenge that the old imperial system would have resolved through decree rather than debate. Any word from the Security Council? Lyra asked. Prince Zalthar's delegation has formally endorsed the non-intervention principle, Yamamoto reported. Lord Kristen's representatives are pushing for stronger language on technological sharing requirements. And Prince Nix, she paused, checking her instruments. Prince Nix has submitted a proposal for the complete abolition of hereditary rulership. Lyra's eyebrows rose. In the years since their first meeting aboard the Defiance, the three former emperors had undergone remarkable transformations. Zalthar had dissolved the Zephyrian Empire and spent 6 months traveling incognito through former imperial territory, learning what life was like for those who had lived under his rule. Kristin had abandoned his crystalline form and taken on a more conventional biological body, claiming he wanted to experience mortality and vulnerability. And Nix had renounced his claim to the Void Realms and spent the past year working as a grief counselor, helping beings process the trauma of living under oppressive systems. The three princes have become more radical than some of our own people, Marcus observed. Sometimes I think they're overcompensating for their imperial past. Or maybe, Lyra suggested, they're finally free to become who they really are instead of who they were expected to be. The observation was interrupted by an alert for the tactical station. Ma'am, we have incoming ships. Multiple vessels, unknown configuration. They're not responding to standard hails. Lyra and Marcus moved quickly to the bridge, where they found Admiral Chun studying a tactical display that showed 27 ships approaching from the direction of the Galactic Core. The vessels were unlike anything in the current databases, sleek, organic-looking things that seemed to flow through space rather than merely traveling through it. Analysis? Lyra asked. Unknown technology, unknown species, the tactical officer reported. They're not using any propulsion system we recognize, and their hull materials don't match anything in our files. Energy signatures suggest they're extremely advanced, possibly more so than any civilization we've encountered. Admiral Chun frowned at the display. How long until they reach the convention site? At current speed, approximately 6 hours. The bridge fell silent as the implications sank in. The convention represented the most comprehensive gathering of galactic leadership in recorded history. If these unknown ships represented a hostile force, they could potentially decapitate the entire democratic movement in a single strike. Options? Lyra asked. We could evacuate the convention, Admiral Chen suggested. Scatter the delegates and reconvene at a safer location. That would look like we're running from the first sign of external pressure, Marcus pointed out. It would undermine everything we've been trying to build. Or, Lyra said slowly, we could do something completely unprecedented. The others looked at her expectantly. We could ask them what they want. Admiral Chen blinked. That's actually not a bad idea. Send a general broadcast on all frequencies. Let them know we're aware of their approach and invite them to participate in the convention as observers. As the communications officer began transmitting, Lyra found herself thinking about the deeper implications of the moment. For 3,000 years, galactic civilization had operated on the assumption that contact between species inevitably led to conquest or subjugation. First contact protocols were essentially lists of who got to rule whom based on technological and military superiority. The idea of simply inviting unknown beings to participate in a democratic process was so radical it bordered on madness. It was perfectly human. Response coming in, the communications officer reported. They're accepting the invitation. And they're asking if they can bring observers from 37 other species that we've never heard of. The silence on the bridge was profound. Humanity had assumed they were dealing with the entirety of galactic civilization, but apparently there was an entire community of species that had managed to remain hidden from imperial expansion. How is that possible? Admiral Chen asked. The answer came 6 hours later, when the unknown ships arrived at the convention site, and their representatives made contact with the human delegation. The being who spoke for them was unlike anything they had encountered, a fluid, shifting entity that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. We are the observers, it said, its voice somehow harmonizing with itself across several different frequencies. We have been watching your galaxy for millennia, waiting for this moment. What moment? Lyra asked. The moment when the cycle of conquest finally broke, the observer replied. The moment when intelligent beings chose cooperation over domination, growth over expansion, evolution over extinction. The entity gestured, and suddenly, the space around the convention site was filled with ships, hundreds of them, representing species that had never appeared in any imperial database. We are the survivors, the observer explained. The ones who escaped the cycle of imperial expansion by removing ourselves from the areas of space where conquest was possible. We have been waiting for the galaxy to mature enough to join the larger community. Marcus felt his worldview shifting as the implications became clear. There's a larger community? The universe is vast, the observer said, its form shimmering with what might have been amusement. What you call the galaxy is merely one small region where intelligent beings have been struggling with the same questions that every emerging civilization must answer. Do we grow through conquest or cooperation? Do we expand through domination or invitation? Do we achieve security through control or through trust? Admiral Chun was studying the sensor readings from the new arrivals. Your technology is based on principles that become available only after a civilization has resolved those fundamental questions, the observer confirmed. The ability to transcend physical limitations, to exist in harmony with the underlying structure of reality itself, to travel between galaxies as easily as you move between star systems. These capabilities emerge naturally from societies that have learned to organize themselves around consent rather than coercion. Lyra felt a strange mixture of awe and vindication. You're saying that democracy isn't just a political system. It's an evolutionary requirement. Not democracy specifically, the observer corrected, but the principles that underlie healthy democratic systems. Respect for individual autonomy, commitment to voluntary cooperation, willingness to resolve conflicts through dialogue rather than violence. These are not just human values. They are universal prerequisites for advancement beyond a certain level. The conversation was interrupted by urgent communications from the convention site. The arrival of hundreds of advanced ships and the revelation of an entirely unknown community of species had caused something approaching chaos among the delegates. We should return to the convention, Marcus suggested. This changes everything. As they prepared to shuttle back to the conference habitat, the observer made one final comment that would reshape the course of galactic civilization. Your revolution was not just about freeing yourselves from imperial oppression, it said. It was about proving that this galaxy was ready to join the community of mature civilizations. You have passed the test. The Constitutional Convention that followed lasted another 6 months, but its focus had shifted dramatically. Instead of simply establishing principles for post-imperial governance, the delegates found themselves crafting the framework for their civilization's integration into a community they had never imagined existed. The document they eventually produced became known as the Universal Charter of Sentient Rights, and it established principles that went far beyond anything that had been conceived during the original rebellion. The right to self-determination was expanded to include not just political autonomy, but biological, cultural, and spiritual self-direction. The prohibition on conquest was strengthened to include any form of imposed change, whether through military force, economic pressure, or cultural manipulation. Most importantly, the Charter established the principle that no being or group of beings had the right to make decisions for others without their explicit, informed, and revocable consent. It was a document that would have been impossible to create under the old imperial system, not just because the empires would have rejected its principles, but because the empires could never have brought together the diversity of perspectives needed to craft it. As Lyra watched the final vote being tallied, unanimous approval from delegates representing over 5,000 worlds, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a symbolic figurehead, the vampire princess who represented humanity's refusal to submit to galactic authority. Now she was witnessing the birth of something entirely new, a civilization based not on the power to command, but on the wisdom to listen, not on the strength to conquer, but on the courage to trust, not on the fear of chaos, but on the hope of possibilities they had never imagined. So, Marcus said, joining her at the observation deck as the convention ships began to disperse, carrying the news of the new galaxy to every corner of known space. What do we do now? Lyra smiled, watching as the observer ships began their graceful departure, their mission complete. Now we find out what we're capable of when we're not spending all our time fighting for the right to exist. The answer, they would discover, was more than any of them had dared to dream. 5 years after the Xerian revelation, Lyra Blackthorn no longer carried the title of princess. The monarchy of Earth had died with the planet itself, and The woman who had once been called the Vampire Princess now served as humanity's first elected ambassador to the galactic community. She stood in the council chamber of New Geneva Station, watching as representatives from 12,000 worlds conducted the first session of the Galactic Assembly under the Universal Charter of Sentient Rights. The chamber itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, a sphere nearly a kilometer in diameter, with seating arranged in concentric rings that rotated slowly to give every delegate an opportunity to address the assembly from the central speaking platform. The agenda for today's session was ambitious even by the standards of the new galactic government. They were voting on humanity's application to join the Observer Corps, the secretive organization that had revealed itself during the Constitutional Convention, and serve as guide for civilizations making the transition to what they called universal citizenship. Nervous, asked Marcus Chun, who had taken the position of Director of Humanitarian Outreach for the Galactic Assembly. His hair had gone completely gray in the past 5 years, but his eyes still held the same quiet determination that had sparked a revolution. Terrified, Lyra admitted, 5 years ago, we were fighting just for the right to exist. Now we're applying to become mentors for other civilizations going through the same struggles we faced. It feels presumptuous. It feels appropriate, corrected a new voice. Ambassador Elena Vasquez approached them across the chamber floor, her diplomatic robes marking her as the representative of the Andromedan Federation, the democratic government that had emerged from the collapsed crystal courts. The former Dr. Vasquez had become one of the galaxy's most respected experts on post-imperial reconstruction, and her work had helped dozens of former subject species establish their own governments. Elena makes a good point, Marcus said. We're not applying because we think we're better than anyone else. We're applying because we've been where they are now. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime that indicated the beginning of the session. The three humans took their places in the Earth delegation section as the assembly speaker called for order. The speaker was a fascinating being, a collective intelligence made up of representatives from 7 different species that had learned to function as a single entity while maintaining their individual identities. It was exactly the kind of impossible compromise that had become commonplace in the new galactic order. The Galactic Assembly recognizes Ambassador Lyra Blackthorne of the Human Federation. The speaker announced, its 7 voices harmonizing into a single clear tone. Lyra rose and made her way to the central platform, conscious of the thousands of eyes, optical sensors, and other sensory organs focused on her. When she had first stood before alien nobility 5 years ago, she had represented the last stubborn remnant of a conquered species. Today, she represented a civilization that had become synonymous with liberation, democracy, and the radical idea that governance required consent. Honored delegates, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. I stand before you not as a princess commanding obedience, not as a conqueror demanding submission, but as a citizen requesting permission to serve. The chamber fell silent. Even now, 5 years after the revolution had transformed galactic civilization, the simple acknowledgement that authority came from those being governed rather than from those doing the governing still had the power to surprise. The Human Federation's application to join the Observer Corps is not based on our technological advancement, our military strength, or our economic power, Lyra continued. It is based on our experience with failure. A ripple of confusion passed through the assembly. This was not the kind of opening speech that delegates had come to expect from aspiring Observer Corps members. In the 20 years between Earth's destruction and the Xerian revelation, humanity made every mistake that a species can make while learning to govern itself, Lyra explained. We established settlements that collapsed due to poor resource management. We created councils that devolved into tyrannies of the majority. We built defensive alliances that became aggressive pacts. We struggled with racism, xenophobia, economic inequality, and the constant temptation to solve problems through force rather than dialogue. She paused, looking around the vast chamber at representatives of species that had spent the past 5 years learning the same difficult lessons. We are not applying to join the Observer Corps because we have transcended these challenges. We are applying because we have learned to live with them, because we have discovered that the goal is not to create perfect societies, but to create resilient ones. Societies that can acknowledge their mistakes, learn from their failures, and continue growing without losing sight of their fundamental values. The platform beneath her feet began to rotate slowly, allowing every delegate in the chamber to see her directly as she spoke. The Universal Charter of Sentient Rights is not a destination, she continued. It is a journey, a commitment to the ongoing work of building civilizations that serve their citizens rather than ruling them. And that work is never finished, never complete, never perfected. She gestured toward the observation gallery, where the translucent forms of Observer Corps members watched the proceedings with interest. The observers have told us that the universe is full of civilizations that have achieved technological transcendence, beings that can manipulate matter and energy at will, travel between galaxies as easily as walking between rooms, and exist in states of consciousness that we can barely comprehend. But they have also told us something more important, that all of this advancement is meaningless without the wisdom to use it responsibly. A soft murmur passed through the chamber as delegates considered the implications of her words. Humanity requests permission to join the Observer Corps, not because we believe we have achieved wisdom, but because we have learned to value it. We have learned that the most advanced technology in the universe is useless if it is controlled by beings who rule without consent. We have learned that the most powerful energy sources are meaningless if they serve only to maintain systems of oppression. We have learned that the greatest knowledge means nothing if it cannot be shared freely among equals. The rotation of the platform brought her face to face with the section where the former imperial rulers sat. Prince Althor had become the elected president of the Zephyrian Democratic Republic. Lord Kristen served as the chief scientist of the Andromedan Federation, and Prince Nix had founded the Void Realms Therapeutic Alliance, an organization dedicated to helping beings recover from the psychological trauma of living under authoritarian systems. 5 years ago, Lyra said, these three beings commanded empires that spanned thousands of star systems and control the lives of trillions of sentient creatures. Today, they serve their people because their people choose to be served by them. This transformation was not achieved through conquest, revolution, or force of any kind. It was achieved through the simple recognition that legitimate authority comes only from the consent of the governed. She turned to address the entire assembly once more. The Human Federation believes that this principle, the principle of consent, is the foundation upon which all truly advanced civilizations must be built. Not because it is efficient, not because it is safe, but because it is right. Because every sentient being deserves the dignity of choice, the responsibility of self-determination, and the opportunity to participate in shaping their own destiny. The chamber had become so quiet that the only sound was the soft hum of the life support systems and the distant vibration of the station's rotation. We do not ask to join the Observer Corps as conquerors who have learned to be benevolent, Lyra concluded. We ask to join as former victims who have learned to be free, as students who wish to become teachers, not because we have all the answers, but because we remember what it feels like to ask the questions. She bowed slightly to the assembly, a gesture of respect rather than submission, and returned to her seat. The voting process took 6 hours. Unlike the old imperial systems where decisions were made by decree or behind closed doors, the Galactic Assembly conducted all its business in full view of the public. Each delegate was required to state their position and explain their reasoning before casting their vote. The arguments in favor of humanity's application were diverse and passionate. Representative Thexes of the Zephyrian Democratic Republic spoke about the human refugees who had helped his people learn to organize their first free elections. Ambassador Coral Song of the Aquatic Collective described how human advisors had helped her species develop underwater cities that functioned as genuine democracies rather than authoritarian hierarchies. The synthetic intelligence, known as Echo, testified about humans' willingness to grant full citizenship rights to artificial beings, making them the first species in galactic history to do so voluntarily. But the arguments against the application were equally compelling. Some delegates worried that humanity's revolutionary history made them too radical to serve as neutral observers. Others questioned whether a species that had been forced to fight for its survival could provide objective guidance to civilizations facing similar challenges. Still others argued that humanity's rapid rise from near extinction to galactic leadership represented an anomaly rather than a model that could be replicated. The most powerful argument against the application came from Ambassador Silence Between Stars of the Deep Void Confederacy, a collection of species that had achieved technological advancement through meditation and contemplation rather than conflict and revolution. The humans speak eloquently of consent and democracy, Ambassador Silence Between Stars said, her words creating visible ripples in the air around the speaking platform. But their path to these ideals was paved with destruction, rebellion, and the overthrow of established order. How can we trust them to guide other species toward peaceful transformation when their own transformation was born from violence? It was a fair question, and one that struck at the heart of humanity's greatest vulnerability. They had achieved their freedom through resistance, their democracy through revolution, their principles through defiance of authority. Could beings who had learned to fight for their rights teach others to claim those rights peacefully? The answer came from an unexpected source. Permission to address the assembly requested a voice from the Observer Corps gallery. A ripple of surprise passed through the chamber. Observer Corps members rarely spoke during public sessions, preferring to offer their guidance through private consultations and carefully worded reports. The speaker granted permission, and a being unlike any they had seen before materialized on the central platform. It appeared to be made of pure light, constantly shifting between different forms and configurations, but somehow maintaining a coherent identity throughout the transformations. I am known as First Question, the being said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal space. I have served as an observer for longer than your galaxy has existed. I have watched the rise. First Question was legendary even among the Observer Corps, a being so ancient and experienced that its very presence transformed the nature of any discussion. The question before us today, First Question continued, is not whether humanity deserves to join our ranks. The question is whether we deserve to have them. The statement was so unexpected that several delegates actually gasped. Every species that achieves universal citizenship does so by solving the same fundamental problem. First Question explained. How do you organize a society so that it serves the needs of all its members while respecting the autonomy of each individual? How do you create structures that provide security without imposing oppression? How do you balance freedom with responsibility, individual rights with collective needs? The being's form shifted, becoming more solid and recognizable, a synthesis of features from dozens of different species represented in the assembly. Some solve it through technological transcendence, using advanced tools to eliminate scarcity and conflict. Some solve it through spiritual enlightenment, achieving such deep understanding of universal principles that selfishness becomes impossible. First Question paused, its attention focusing directly on the Human Federation delegation. Humanity solved it through failure. They tried every possible way of organizing society except the one that required them to trust each other. The images shifted to show the more recent history, Earth's destruction, humanity's survival and hiding, the slow building of the resistance that had ultimately transformed galactic civilization. As the assembly dispersed and delegates began making their way back to their ships and stations, Lyra found herself standing once again at an observation deck, watching the vast symphony of galactic civilization as it went about its daily business. But now, instead of the rigid hierarchies, now we become the teachers we needed when we were students, the guides we wished for when we were lost, the proof that it is possible to build something better, especially when you don't know exactly what better looks like. Marcus nodded, understanding. And if we make mistakes along the way, Lyra's smile became radiant with possibility. Then, we'll do what humans have always done. We'll admit we were wrong, learn from our failures, and try again. Because that's what free beings do. Outside the viewport, a new ship was arriving at the station, sleek and unfamiliar, bearing the markings of a species that had never before made contact with galactic civilization. Another species taking its first tentative steps into the larger community. Another civilization beginning to ask the dangerous questions that led to freedom. Humanity's real work was just beginning, and for the first time in their history, they were looking forward to it. In the years that followed, the galaxy would face new challenges, make new mistakes, and discover new possibilities. There would be conflicts to resolve, problems to solve, and choices to make that no one had ever faced before. But they would face them together as equals, as citizens of a community built on a radical idea that every sentient being deserved the right to choose their own destiny. It was messy, inefficient, sometimes frustrating, and occasionally dangerous. It was also the most beautiful thing that had ever existed in the known universe. And it all began with a human woman who refused to choose between tyrants, a human man who never forgot that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, and the revolutionary idea that consent was not just a political principle, but a universal truth. The vampire princess who had once fed on the surrender of oppressors had become something far more powerful, a teacher who helped others learn to feed on hope. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be.